This is Dr. J. Kent Gregory, and welcome to part two of chapter five of Human Resource Management. This is the selection process, and this was written and put together by Laura Portalese. Let's continue on with where we left off. So we get to interviewing, and there are a number of different types of interviews. Uh, and over the course of my professional career, I've had, you know, many of these. I haven't had a video interview. I have had everything else here. So anyway, so the types of interviews you have are the traditional interviews, um, where one would sit down with the selection committee or the selection individual. Telephone interviews, panel interviews, information interviews, meal interviews, group interviews, video interviews, and non-directive interviews. So some interview questions to avoid, and this is something you have to be very careful about. And even though this may seem obvious, it's worth repeating. So you cannot ask about national origin, age, marital status, religion, disabilities, criminal record, or even personal questions. So you have to avoid all of those. And you have to be aware of interview bias. So the different types of biases that you as an interviewer need to be aware of uh, are halo or reverse halo effect bias, contrast bias, gut feeling bias. So gut feeling bias obviously is where you're like, gosh, I can't put my finger on it, but I feel really good about this candidate. Uh, Generalization bias, cultural noise bias, nonverbal behavior bias, similar to me bias, and recency bias. And these are all discussed in the book, so it's worthwhile referring back to the book to get a good description of what these are and to see what they are like. So the interview process. The process itself, you know, you want to recruit new candidates, establish criteria for which candidates will be rated, develop interview questions based on the analysis, set up a timeline for interviewing and decision making. And again, that's something that's really important. You want to have a timeline, with an end and with a beginning and and an end date, uh, so that not only will you know what your goals are, but that it's something that's known to the potential candidates. So connect schedules with others involved in the interview process, set up the interviews with the candidates, and set up any testing procedures that you might want to employ. Interview the candidates and perform the testing. And then once all the results are back, you want to meet with the hiring team to discuss each candidate and make a decision based on the criteria that you've already established. And then finally, once you and the hiring team have arrived at a candidate, you put together the offer. So some key takeaways. So just to go back and review some of this. Traditional, telephone, panel, informational, meal, group, and video are the types of interviews. And you may end up using a combination of these through the course of the interview process, not only across all of the candidates, but for each candidate. Uh, a structured interview format means the questions are determined ahead of time, and unstructured means the questions are based on the individual candidate. Frankly, I prefer the structured interview format where you have things planned out, although it is valued to have some flexibility there where you do morph into an unstructured means as the situation allows or presents itself or maybe even demands. The advantage of a structured interview that all candidates are rated on the same criteria. Um, Interview questions can revolve around situational questions or behavioral questions. So situational questions focus on asking someone what they would do in a given situation, right? Whereas behavioral questions ask candidates what they have done in certain situations. So situational questions are hypotheticals. Behavioral questions are actually historical. What has the candidate actually done? And a good interview is going to use a combination of both. Um, we talked about what interviews to avoid, and then it's important to discuss a little bit the halo effect. So this assumes that one desirable trait means that all traits are desirable. So it should be avoided. The halo effect is, let's say you identify a trait in the candidate that is really good. Say, for example, their experience that they've shown or a particular answer they give. You don't want that answer to overshadow uh, and nullify the other answers that the candidate may give. So we talk about the interview process. And then finally, developing a rapport, being honest, and managing the interview process are tips to having a successful interview. So that's really good. You do want to try to establish a rapport with the candidate, do want to be honest and forthright about what's going on. And you want to manage the interview process in a uniform manner. So that brings us to the end of part 2 of chapter 5.